In the early 20th century, a young Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung was taken under Sigmund Freud's wing to become his intellectual successor and to further advance the field of psychoanalysis. However, as Jung's influence grew, he had a falling out with Freud. Sigmund Freud, despite some of his questionable ideas, considered himself to be a man of science, and felt that things like religion, mysticism, Eastern philosophy, and astrology had no place in an academic understanding of the human mind. Carl Jung, on the other hand, felt that those things were essential and therefore should be integrated into therapy and psychological research. And he was wildly influential amongst religious psychologists because of his willingness to combine the academic and the religious side of the therapy experience. Astrologists, in particular, were drawn to his idea of the universal unconscious and the archetypes, which suggested that all human beings have a shared, deeper psyche that can be accessed through things like dreams, myths, and spiritual systems like the zodiac and horoscopes. And while he never outright identified himself as an astrologist in the religious sense, he did believe that the timing of your birth had an impact on your personality, and that personality was something that could be connected to the universal archetypes, which decided whether you were more introverted or extroverted, more rational or emotional, and so on. Fast forward to the World Wars, and governments became very concerned with understanding personality archetypes for military, business, and educational reasons. The idea was that understanding personalities could make military units better aligned, businesses more productive, and schools better able to push students down the correct career paths. And they largely depended upon Jungian psychologists in order to advance this work, especially educators like the American Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Myers, who used Jung's ideas about the universal archetypes to create the most commercially successful personality assessment ever, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, also known as MBTI, also known as the 16 personalities. Setting history aside, the MBTI has become an economic force to be reckoned with. MBTI tests cost anywhere between $50 and $120, and getting certified by the Myers-Briggs company costs anywhere from $2,500 to $3,500 per person. The test is used in 88% of Fortune 500 companies and virtually all public universities across the United States, with many of those schools' advisors, career coaches, and psychologists being certified by the Myers-Briggs company, myself included. I'm an ENTJ, by the way. Now, generally speaking, the MBTI and some other tools used in schools and therapy are straight up pseudoscience. Learning styles are pseudoscience. Okay, you're not a kinesthetic learner, your mom was just gaslit by racist magicians in the 70s. Playing Mozart to fetuses does not make babies smarter. Reiki therapy is not real. Okay, you are not a Lucario. It just feels nice to close your eyes and have a woman touch you. And a lot of these other tools around personality, cognition, and so on, like enneagrams, homeopathy, the law of attraction, etc., 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 just aren't real outside occasionally convincing people to take certain actions that therefore makes those tools a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's all horoscopes, repackaged as academics to the extent that they legally can, and then sold to businesses, schools, governments, and psychologists. And if you work in education, then there's a good chance that you interact with this stuff at every conference and staff retreat that you go to, regardless of whether it's real or not. There are just too many spiritual New Age people working in schools that the uphill battle to fight them is often not worth it, especially after your management was convinced to drop $20,000 to send your teams to one of these summer training camps, and especially if they used taxpayer dollars in order afford to do it, which we will dive into later in this video. But you might think at surface level that this isn't such a bad thing. I mean, these tests help foster self-awareness, and even if it is all scientifically bullshit, having a better understanding of ourselves does help us take effective next steps towards our goals. This is harmless, right? There are many recorded instances of personality assessments ruining people's lives when used incorrectly. Reddit and LinkedIn are filled with anecdotes of people losing jobs because they had the wrong Myers-Briggs type or because they failed a job application's personality test. And there have been some high-level news stories of business executives, engineers, and other high earners with important jobs getting denied promotions or straight up getting fired because they didn't align with that particular company's pseudoscientific assessment of choice. Even contractors at Google have been caught sending their team's information to business astrologers who use things like numerology and horoscopes to decide who on a team should get promotions. According to this news report, forcing bosses who work with them to come up with alternative explanations for their decisions, instead of telling people that they missed out on promotions because they're Libras or Scorpios. But if you think losing your job to a personality assessment is bad, try losing your baby. Up until January of this year, the Danish government forced Greenlandic mothers to take a personality assessment to decide whether they were civilized enough to raise kids, forcibly taking away Inuit mothers' babies whenever they failed these personality tests, something Greenlander mothers were 5 times more likely to do than mainland Danish mothers because of linguistic and cultural barriers. And sure, the system was technically in place to protect children from growing up in abusive households. But considering that 1 in every 20 Greenlandic babies were being taken away because of personality tests, this goes beyond simple child protection and starts to raise legitimate human rights concerns, in my opinion. Anyway, as of recent reports, it's estimated that there are currently 460 Greenlandic babies up for adoption because of this system, a system that only recently went away because of the United States' advancements on Greenland, which gave them enough bargaining power with the Danish government in order to advocate for themselves and be taken seriously by Denmark. Anyway, not to lose the plot here and to circle back to schools and astrology, while personality assessments are not required to be considered on things like 504 plans and IEPs, other related tools are. Tools that are either based in astrology or New Age thinking, or that are being leveraged by astrologists who are working in the school system. And while I certainly won't be arguing against the religious freedom of any professional working in schools, hashtag First Amendment, we need to acknowledge the negative trickle-down ramifications that these kinds of assessments can have on kids. As we learned from the rampant misdiagnosis of ADHD in the early 2000s, particularly against boys, being labeled as special needs in America can have a massive negative snowball effect on your overall academic career. Being forced into remedial classes right off the bat eventually loses you access to things like honors, concurrent enrollment, and AP, which denies you access to scholarships and just generally creates a negative school experience overall. All because you were labeled as low IQ or having behavioral issues as a 6-year-old, even if you didn't actually have any developmental issues and were just an obnoxious little boy, whom it was easier for teachers and parents to quarantine and drug than it was to actually deal with you while you grew up and matured a little bit. The ramifications of which we are now seeing 20 years later as male enrollment rates in universities have been completely decimated. We will get get into how the pharmaceutical industrial complex promotes pseudoscience in the classroom later in this video, but I need to make it very clear that personality assessments are not the only culprit here. Things like learning styles, emotional intelligence or EQ, humanistic psychology, and other tools getting used in classrooms every single day have their roots in some very questionable origins, with some tools getting criticized because they're just not based in good science, to others that are literally based in astrology and are used by those communities for things like alchemy, divinations, fortune telling, and so on. See, all of the tools that I'm going to talk about today fall under an umbrella of research called psychometrics. People who believe in astrology love psychometrics, but psychometrics themselves are not astrology, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. So I'm gonna go all 7th grade research paper on you for a second and quickly define the term. According to this NIH citation, psychometrics is the discipline concerned with the measurement and prediction of psychological traits, aptitudes, and behavior, which plays a central role in scientific psychology, educational measurements, and the structure of our current society. All of these things are concerned with what you would call latent constructs in statistics, which means trying to measure something that can't technically be measured, like happiness or introversion. So if you're giving somebody a test to see how sad or extroverted they are, that's psychometrics. A lot of psychometrics are pretty good and useful. Some are really bad, but all of them have been criticized in academia for a few key reasons. First and foremost, psychometrics are not clearly defined. Not to go all philosophy 1010 on you, but what does being happy even mean? What does being extroverted even mean? Can someone even define those terms for us? And when they do, aren't they just using another subjective term in the definition that's caught up in other latent constructs that have their whole other set of criticisms surrounding them? Like, you can argue that being introverted means that time alone gives you energy while time with other people drains your energy. But that's not true all the time. Some people might gain energy around their friends, but lose energy around their family members. A fit, wealthy, neurotypical person might rank their energy levels differently than somebody who's out of shape, poor, and depressed would. And what even is energy? Isn't that technically a spiritual concept that we use to kind of broadly explain a combination of hormonal, sensory, and dopaminergic responses to stimuli in the body? Anyway, I'm done being like that douche at the house party, but I want to make it clear that psychometrics come with a lot of assumptions that aren't always clearly defined. The next big criticism is that they're almost always culturally biased. Being an extrovert in America means something very different than being an extrovert in Japan. So establishing a cultural baseline for psychometrics often involves tacking on other subjective fields of study like anthropology, sociology, history, and economics that have their own latent constructs that have their own problems and criticisms. And to top it all off, there's quite a bit of evidence that psychologists tend to treat their personality as good personalities. Introverts think that they're deep and enlightened. Rational people think that they have a true understanding of the world. Empathetic people feel like they're the most connected to other human beings. It is very hard for us to see our personalities as not inherently good personalities. And researchers are not immune to this. And so if psychometrics is being carried out by specific demographics of people, then the traits and values that those people have been conditioned to have are going to end up being what educators and psychologists determine to be the best traits, which we will definitely get into in a minute when we talk about the statistics around astrology belief in America. But the next big criticism of psychometrics is that they often aren't predictive. What does that mean? That means that you can't really guess how somebody is going to do something until they've already done it. Like, you can't assume that your kid will be good at school because they like reading. You can't assume that someone will be successful in the military because they're more stoic. Like, take it from me, I used to work as a forensic scientist, and you just could not guess how somebody would react to a traumatic crime scene until they were actually put in one. Trying to hire for that job based off personality was just not an effective use of our time, because personality is not predictive of behavior. And the same goes for psychometrics that try to decide whether somebody will be good in business or in school. The only thing that you can really do is take people who were already successful and then reverse engineer their habits and personalities in order to try to glean some secrets about success in the process. But there are just too many factors that influence success or failure that that's not a very useful practice. Which leads us to the fourth criticism of psychometrics, which is that they often ignore systemic issues. I might be a straight white male living in America, but I grew up in financial poverty and had to move apartments every single year growing up. So I look at the world and navigate life very differently than another straight white American dude would, who grew up, say, rich in Connecticut and is now president of his college fraternity's yacht club. Different things scare me, different things motivate me, and I have a much better spice tolerance than that dude does. And that's the thing in psychometrics, right? Is if you try to understand every single systemic issue that influences somebody's, personality and behaviors, the result that you get is going to be so individually personalized that it just won't be useful when trying to compare it to somebody else, which is great for therapy, but not very good for science at scale. And then the last critique of psychometrics is, funnily enough, the halo effect. Researchers have this tendency to treat intelligence and empathy as inherently good characteristics to have. But that's not always the case. A smart PhD candidate might be incapable of teaching college classes because they just have no social skills. An ambitious leader might sabotage their workers for financial gain. An empathetic mother might use those insights about her kids in order to emotionally abuse them. Having a good trait does not make you a good person, and psychometrics just tends to ignore that. So putting these all together then, why are people who believe in astrology and other new age spiritual ideas so drawn to psychometrics and the industries that use them? It's because it reinforces their worldview, provides an academic form of personal validation, and gives them plausible deniability when they get criticized in a professional setting. If you believe that personalities are a real thing and that human beings have shared archetypes and a universal unconscious, then you are going to perceive psychometrics as the academic branch of your religion. And because psychometrics, by their nature, operate within an academic gray area, that gives you plausible deniability whenever another professional accuses you of using astrology or pseudoscience in your psychological or educational practice. And that makes it really hard to have conversations like this, because there will be intelligent, secular people in the comments who are very upset that I say that they are using pseudoscience in their jobs. And they have every right in the world to be upset with me about that. But I am uniquely qualified to talk about this. One, because I spent my 20s doing all kinds of research and jobs around things like religious violence, socioeconomics, scams, and cybersecurity. So I have seen firsthand just how much that gray area of science gets used in order to abuse people, as well as how it gets weaponized by spiritualists working in the school system who are trying to impose their more mystical worldview on children without getting caught. And because I work in the public university system, I teach classes on the job market, and even I get forced to use scientifically suspect tools like personality assessments, emotional intelligence, and learning styles against my own students, whether they resonate with them or not, because there is a small but mighty force of spiritualist pro staff at every university who convince management to spend tens of thousands of dollars every single summer to send us to these training camps and to incorporate these ideas into our own curriculum. But I am sick and tired of spreading pseudoscience in the classroom and being academically dishonest with my students. So my hope with this video is that you can take the examples that I give of these things to your own management, to your own boss, to your own schools, to your own loved ones, and spread awareness of where this stuff comes from and how it's being used. But that's enough about me. Let's shift gears here and really hone in on the belief in astrology in America, because this is a lot bigger than you probably think it is. In the United States, surveys find that about 1 in every 4 people believes in astrology to some extent. And of the people who do, about 2/3 believe that they can use things like horoscopes, energies, and psychics in order to directly influence their careers or people around them. Unsurprisingly, people who are already part of religions with more mystical traditions, like Catholicism and Hinduism, are more likely to believe in astrology than religious people who are not. On the other hand, people like evangelicals or self-described atheists are the least likely to believe in astrology, which makes sense because these types of people are the most likely to reject other cultural or religious ideas outright. However, interestingly, the largest group of people who believe in astrology are those who claim to have no religious identity at all. These are the people called religious nuns in statistical surveys, which is where I start to have beef with these findings. A lot of quote-unquote spiritual but not religious people in America really only say that because they're part of a not widely recognized community, despite borrowing heavily from mystic or reconstructionist movements like Kabbalah, Wicca, or heathenry. The dominance of Christianity in our culture has really narrowed what we choose to define as a religion versus just spirituality. But that's a whole other can of worms, and technically people have every right to identify however they want, hashtag First Amendment, so we're just gonna set that aside from now and take this data at face value. So looking at age, young adults closer to 18 tend to believe in astrology at higher rates than the general population. However, as women in particular age, they tend to believe in astrology more and more as their life goes on. A 45-year-old woman, especially if she is white, black, or Latina, is very likely to believe in astrology, especially if she doesn't already identify with a different organized religion. And that might make you think, a 45-year-old spiritual but not religious woman of a Western race. That sure sounds like a lot of therapists and teachers in America, and you would be onto something with that observation. Western culture generally buys into the idea of clinical psychology as a tool for self-improvement more than Eastern culture does. If you're white, black, or Hispanic, you are just more likely to be an individualist who believes that focusing on your personal mental health and understanding yourself is something that matters. And so that trickles down into the racial demographics of education and psychology. From there, we have gendered reasons. Prior to the 19th century, pretty much all teachers and psychologists in the West were men. But as women left domestic roles and entered the workforce, they took those skills that they had from managing the household and overwhelmingly went into more caregiver-y type jobs, which over time made us associate those jobs with being feminine. Beyond that, the historically low pay associated with working in schools, mental health, or social services meant that men were less incentivized from staying in those jobs because they were expected to be the primary breadwinner for their family. So the fact that teaching and psychology became perceived as feminine, coupled with the historically low pay in those industries, heavily pushed men out. But there is nothing uniquely male or female when it comes to being a good educated teacher or therapist. Working with the public takes all types, and it would be very good for America if more men went into things like teaching or psychology beyond just being a college professor or a psychiatrist. And honestly, would probably solve the whole astrology problem that we're having, but that's a whole other conversation. Regardless, today in colleges, 80% of psychology majors are women, and 75% of secondary education majors are women, which is fine, but like any field, a severe lack of diversity is the thing that allows systemic issues, cultural bias, and pseudoscience to take hold, even if most people in that field are well-intentioned, because we are just less likely to question bad ideas when those bad ideas happen to positively impact us or young people who are like us. And so the traits that Western women are socialized to value, like agreeableness, cooperation, and empathy, are what get rewarded in schools. And more socially masculine traits, like ambition, competitiveness, and confidence, are what get demonized in schools. I wish this wasn't the case, but that's just where we're at, and children do cue into this. Discourse around personality treats people who are more introverted, agreeable, and emotionally motivated like they are better people. And when something tells you that you are a good person, you start to believe it. And that creates a vicious cycle where people in a field unintentionally rig that field to only cater to the younger versions of themselves. And that, by extension, pushes more and more outsiders out who would have potentially added valuable perspectives and passion to the industry. Which then begs the question, is there a conspiracy here? So, is there a conspiracy to use schools and therapy offices to push astrology on the general public? No, obviously not. At least not at scale. But that doesn't mean that there aren't bad actors who are doing this on purpose. See, a few months ago, I made a video about how so many best-selling business books are being written and published by either religious extremists or religious organizations trying to integrate their personal beliefs into popular business jargon. But that doesn't mean that there's a full-on conspiracy. Simply believing in something like the prosperity gospel or divine occupation means that you are more likely to assign religious value to something like wealth. And at scale, that just means that there are more people who feel a divine calling to do something like write business books. And the same goes for astrology. If you believe that there are universal archetypes and that you can divine information about people based off of their sign or the personality that they were born with, I'm an Aries, by the way, then you are going to see psychometrics as the scientific branch of your personal beliefs and biases. And you will probably feel genuinely called into fields that use psychometrics, like psychology or education, out of a genuine desire to help people. Or you will start to impose your beliefs on people once you finally gain power as something of a form of revenge for getting made fun of and disregarded for your kooky beliefs over the years. That's kind of how we get these things in the business world more so than in schools. But I think we have thrown enough shade at innocent middle-aged white women for one video, and I really don't want to demonize people who just happen to be spiritual but are still living their lives without hurting anyone. So let's start by talking about the people and institutions in power. Starting with Division 32 of the American Psychological Association. Throughout the 20th century, Abraham Maslow pioneered a field of study called humanistic psychology. That's right, Mr. Hierarchy of Needs himself, of meme fame. Maslow saw behavioral studies and psychoanalysis as being too limited, so he worked with other psychologists like Carl Rogers to develop a holistic and positive view of human nature centered around existentialism, phenomenology, and self-actualization, What does that mean in English? It means everybody dies someday, there's not much you can do about it, and if you don't believe in reincarnation, then this is it. So you'd might as well get over your traumas as quickly as possible and enjoy the rest of the ride while it lasts. I dig it. And to give my boy credit where it's due, he was pretty critical of using spiritual explanations to explain psychological phenomena. But that doesn't mean that his followers were. A lot of them are still alive. New Age thinkers really took Maslow's ideas and ran, starting things like the human potential movement, getting heavily involved in psychedelic studies, and trying to bring things like Eastern philosophy and transcendental meditation into therapies and schools. It was, as Elizabeth Puttick puts it, a counter-cultural rebellion against mainstream psychology and organized religion. That was until it got integrated into mainstream psychology. And the Society of Humanistic Psychology became Division 32 of the American Psychological Association. The APA is the largest psychological association in the world, and as the name suggests, the main professional organization for psychologists in America, boasting over 150,000 members and an annual budget of $125 million. Not bad. Now, I have no beef with the APA itself. Sure, they've had some controversies, and yes, they've flip-flopped on issues over the decades, suggesting that they're probably more concerned with the political zeitgeist than they necessarily are with doing kind of science, but that's professional organizations for you. Their concern is making money by staying relevant, providing a platform for psychological researchers to publish, and hosting conferences, which we will get into in a second. Now, one could argue that having that much money and influence means that you inherently have power over, and therefore the ability to regulate your industry, and that you should treat that responsibility for what it is. But we're not here today to critique the APA. We are here to look at specific sponsors, subdivisions, and individuals who use the APA as a platform to spread pseudoscience. So, the American Psychological Association is split up into 54 different divisions, which, as they say, provide many ways for you to network with professionals in your field and become an influencer in your special area of interest. Yo, be sure to like and subscribe. Sorry. Wait, hold up. They have merch? As I was saying, the APA is divided into 54 different subdivisions based around special interest areas. These divisions have their own members, host their own conferences, and publish their own journals. And like I said before, Division 32 is the Society of Humanistic Psychology, which got added in 1971 and had their journal officially included in the APA's publications in 2016. Division 32 is what I like to call the min-maxer of popular psychology. On the one hand, they have done some incredible work fixing some serious ethical concerns with how therapy has been carried out historically. And their willingness to delve into things like meditation and psychedelics has made some genuine strides in how we treat trauma therapy in particular. On the other hand, that willingness to research the mystical, spiritual, and transcendent aspects of the human experience has created a platform to give academic legitimacy to people who are doing both science and theology at the same time, leading to some pretty blurred lines and allowing a lot of grifters to make their way into the formal school system after getting their research published, especially those who participate in transpersonal psychology, positive psychology, or the human potential movements on the side. This is where you get into stuff like holotropic breathwork in order to produce altered states of consciousness, past life regression therapy that tries to access memories from your past lives, energy healing, astral projections, and then white people taking drugs to go on shamanic vision quests, which I myself have participated in before as a taxpayer-funded activity. I shit you not. Now, generally speaking, Division 32 does try to publicly distance itself from those things, and really anything else that could be seen as more metaphysical than scientific. However, in my opinion, they still pander heavily to people who believe this stuff. Their YouTube videos, the conferences they endorse, and the speakers they have at events cross these lines all the fucking time, and have a massive spiritualist kick to them. Like, I mean, look at that, come on. And going through their latest newsletter, the imagery and the language that they use is incredibly spiritual, which would normally not be appropriate in an academic setting. They refer to people as serving spirits 15 different times. They talk about authenticity being rooted in eternity, and they use some very flowery and poetic language that's just not accessible to a general audience at all. Not that it has to be, but when you do that, when you use group-specific terms and complicated language on purpose, that's almost always used as a tactic to pander to an in-group and to signal loyalty to a set of beliefs. This approach is called shibboleth, and it is really common. Not only does it establish an in-group, but it can subtly be used to keep outsiders out, and can be a really effective dog whistle for knowing what somebody's true beliefs are. Like, you can't very well go on national television and call yourself a racist. No, you have to hide it behind more socially acceptable language and talk about thugs and illegals instead. You hide your true feelings behind acceptable words to avoid getting in trouble. And what I'm seeing in humanistic psychology is a heck of a lot of dog whistles for new age spiritual thinking. Calling someone a serving spirit, talking about one's true nature, being on a journey, coming into your true eternal self, treating Old Saybrook, Connecticut like your holy city when you talk about it. Sure, this might all have some slightly culty vibes, but there's nothing inherently wrong with academics talking this way, because they are technically not saying that you have an eternal soul. They're not technically talking about self-actualization or enlightenment. They're not technically talking about integrating your psyche with the universe. And that's exactly my point. You can secretly say that that's what you believe your work is doing without actually saying it. And that gives you a shield of plausible deniability in academia. Now, for the sake of sportsmanlike behavior, I am not going to call out any one individual person in Division 32, the APA, or humanistic psychology in general. I'm a flawed person, I have my own biases and beliefs, and it just would not be fair for me to target an individual person who happens to be religious but is still doing their job. So I'm going to use the rest of this video to instead talk about the different practices, pedagogies, and tools that are commonly used in schools but are rooted in pseudoscience. And more often than not, specifically astrology or other new age spiritualist movements. So without further ado, these are my top 15 pseudosciences used in schools every day. Number 1. Okay, I'm sorry, I'll stop. First up, we've got learning styles. You've probably heard this referred to as VAK, which stands for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And it just refers to this idea that children favor learning through certain senses, like sight, sound, or touch, and that you should tailor their education to that sensory preference. However, learning styles are a classic example of the Barnum effect, which is where you tell somebody vague information about themselves and they end up believing it. That's actually how horoscopes work. And so, if somebody believes a vague statement about themselves, like being an auditory learner, then they're probably going going to be more confident when listening to a lecture, but feel less confident when trying to study from a textbook, which ends up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of that identity that was imposed on them. However, learning styles are a neuromyth. They have been debunked many times over by lots of different psychological and educational studies. And anytime when they try to test teachers to guess their own students' preferred study methods, teachers tend to fail those tests 70% of the time. It's not because they're bad teachers, it's just that learning styles aren't real. Similar to that is left brain, right brain learning. Lateralization of the brain is incredibly complex, and both halves of your brain do work together on virtually all cognitive tasks. Trying to determine what parts of the brain impact what thought processes or personality is rooted in some deep racism in science. And the only people who are really into that idea now are people operating out of more new age schools, which we will talk about in a bit. Next up, we've got enneagrams, cause grifters gotta grift. This is a personality assessment used by both schools and businesses to try to connect people to one of 9 different interconnected personalities. The origins of this are up for debate, and every likely candidate ends up becoming a little more wacky than the last. But it's probably from South America, it's probably from shamanic psychospiritualists, and it's probably based off the ideas of the Fourth Way, which was written by this one cult leader who was very into East Asia. Aren't we all? Speaking of Japanese women, Reiki, or Reiki, is a form of energy healing that channels a person's universal life energy or aura through touch or spiritual attunement. Outside of the placebo effect, there's just no evidence that this works, but that doesn't stop there from being 1,000 Reiki clinics in every single major US city. And that doesn't stop all kinds of grifters from astrally projecting this nonsense onto the American school system either. On a similar but less common note, we've got chakra-based teaching methods. Yes, like Naruto. This is derived directly from Hinduism, so I am going to respect a lot of people's religious beliefs and not talk too much shit, but there is just not any scientific evidence that the human body is an energy system that can be aligned, altered, or traced, and so it's intellectually dishonest whenever you find it in public schools. There are actually a few others stripped from the Vedic tradition, so I'm just gonna talk about those back to back. Coming in 6th, we've got yoga. Now, this is going to ruffle some feathers, so let me just say right off the bat that yes, stretching and exercise is very good for you. But yoga itself is a set of physical, spiritual, and mental practices that religious people in India partake in order to attain various what we'll call salvation goals. That might be moksha or nirvana, that might be to serve as training in discipline or meditation, or it might be used to attain a higher form of consciousness or godhood. While Americans have gotten pretty good at compartmentalizing yoga, the exercise, apart from yoga, the religious practice, it's still virtually impossible to find a yoga class in this country that doesn't at least feature Sanskrit chanting, references to the chakras, or lines from the sutras. It's all super caked into this, even in the secular forms of yoga that are out there. Much like what we'll see in number 7, mindfulness. This is really going to ruffle some feathers. So yes, again, mindfulness does have some scientifically proven utility in relaxation-based therapy models, but it is also a multi-billion-dollar religious industry that has done a lot of harm and is not universally useful. Much like Reiki, a lot of the benefits really just come down to closing your eyes and breathing for a while. But again, mindfulness is derived from different Buddhist disciplines like Vipassana and Zen. And so even the most popular secularized versions of it, like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy, were still largely developed by Buddhist practitioners. So it's not uncommon to have a guided 5-minute mindfulness sesh at work that still features a lot of religious motifs and ratings from religious writings. While mindfulness practice itself is not a pseudoscience. Most of the industry that surrounds it is. And so it's just really important to be mindful whenever you're adopting these programs. Taking that a step further, we then get transcendental meditation, or TM. This typically involves silent mantra repetition, which is meant to connect you to a higher form of consciousness and to improve cognitive ability. That's actually what's happening in the song My Sweet Lord by George Harrison, by the way. And if I have the time, I will get into the role that the Beatles have weirdly played in all of this. But the measurable effects of TM are shaky at best, and have never really been proven to be any better than other secular relaxation techniques. Okay, moving away from Eastern religion and even away from the New Age for just a second, for number 9, I really want to clump all kind of Christian-based training programs together. Wait, I should have made the Beatles reference number 9, damn it! Anyway, there are just too many Christian-adjacent training programs in psychology and education to count. But things like love languages, working genius, designing your life, and the Leader in Me, or Lighthouse schools, were all created by religious grifters trying to repackage their beliefs as science and impose it upon schools in order to make a profit. That doesn't mean that the advice is bad per se, it's just not coming from a place of legitimate economic, psychological, or educational research, so it's still important to be wary whenever you adopt these programs. For number 10, we've got multiple intelligences, finally reining it back into astrology once more. This is the idea that there is a low correlation between different categories of intelligence, that somebody might be, linguistically smart, or math smart, or spatially smart, or, artistically smart. However, most research on intelligence, which in and of itself is a whole can of worms, does tend to find that there is a high correlation between intellectual competence. Somebody who is good at math in school is very statistically likely to also be good at things like English and instruments. It's very rare to find somebody who is a total genius in some domain of life and then a total dumbass in every other domain. Except PhD students. Where this gets caught up in spiritualism, however, is that fans of MI tend to treat intelligence as manifested spiritual force. That you are tapping into your true eternal self by identifying your intelligences and then leaning into those. You can find very similar concepts in personality assessments like Working Genius or the Clifton Strengths. But again, this stuff is almost never predictive and falls into a lot of the same traps that I talked about when addressing criticisms of psychometrics earlier in this video. Okay, this is taking forever, so I'm gonna speedrun the last 5. Number 11's aromatherapy. It's just essential oils. The idea is that plant essences have spiritual properties that can change your brain chemistry by smelling them. Despite what Tanya from next door tells you, this is not true. Please stop buying these things. Just clean your house and take some ibuprofen and the headache will probably go away. Actually, quick side note, even though I just said I was speedrunning, plague doctors used to wear those masks with the long noses because they would put protective herbs inside, which was supposed to cleanse the miasma before entering their body and help prevent disease. It didn't work. Much like essential oils. Speaking of things that don't work, we've got the law of attraction, also known as quantum mysticism, also known far more commonly as manifesting. The idea is that your consciousness literally affects the universe, and that through the right practices, you can literally think things like money and romance into existence. This depends on a lot of the same assumptions that astrology does, like the observer effect, cosmic connectedness, energy fields, entanglement, and so on. Where you see this in schools are through programs like SEL, positive thinking curricula, and You Create Your Reality programs. And then the last 3 aren't really spiritual in origin, so much as they are a result of widespread misinformation. 13th, we've got detox programs for kids. Things like the Feingold and GAPS diets that try to treat kids of their ADHD or autism by feeding them a ton of juice and raw vegetables. This is horrible for children. Okay, juice is not good for you. Not to burst that bubble or anything, but it's literally just fiberless sugar water. It is just as bad as soda, and human beings, especially children, need vegetables to be cooked in order for those foods to become more bioavailable in their gut so that they can actually absorb vitamins from them. Raw vegetables will not cure kids of their ADHD. The whole crunchy mom to alt-right pipeline is a very real thing in the school system right now, and it's incredibly difficult to avoid in schools. What starts out as a mom obsessively swapping out a kid's Dr. Pepper with apple juice ends up becoming the first domino that eventually triggers a measles outbreak in an elementary school. Kind of like how 9/11 gave us 50 Shades of Grey. Speaking of things that are hard to avoid in schools, we've got emotional intelligence, or EQ theory. This is the idea that you can measure a child's self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills, which is totally fine whenever you use these as soft skills or subjective metrics. But this often delves into pseudoscience territory whenever schools try to invest in EQ workshops or programs that were made by new age self-help coaches, many of whom are also astrologers because, of course, they are. And then 15 is whole language reading instruction and sight word memorization. This is the idea that children should learn whole words in English like kanji instead of through phonics, which was terrible for literacy in English-speaking countries and is a big part of why so many Gen Xers are just bad at spelling today. Fortunately though, things like whole word recognition have been pretty much phased out of public schools in America. However, things like manifesting, energy healing, detoxes, personality assessments, EQ, and really everything else that I've talked about still ends up becoming a major part of the curricula in a lot of public schools across America today, and even more so at publicly funded Montessori or Waldorf charter schools. In 1904, Rudolf Steiner founded the esoteric school of the Theosophical Society. This was the first of several schools that Steiner would create, and were the foundation that all future Waldorf schools are built upon, now totaling over 1,000 worldwide, many of which are in North America, and many of which are funded by taxpayer dollars via legal workarounds in the charter school system. See, Waldorf schools are based off of the pedagogical philosophy of Rudolf Steiner, a prolific religious thinker during World War Germany who founded the esoteric spiritualist movement of anthroposophy, which claims that there is an objective spiritual world that human beings can directly interact with. He was somewhat interested in things like astrology and the zodiac as a way to understand human destiny, but more than anything, Steiner was concerned with spiritual bodies, more so in their impact on agriculture, which is, like, scientifically valid. Where Steiner gets into trouble, however, were his ideas around clairvoyance, racial evolution, and Atlantis. He preached the idea that some races were more advanced than others in terms of their spiritual evolution. But that was 20th century Europe for you. Aren't we glad that we've gotten over this? Steiner also believed that he was clairvoyant, that he could use spiritual development as a way to glean cosmic truths about the universe, and that this approach would be faster and more effective than trying to find out truths through scientific research. And then, like any good crazy white dude, he believed in things like Atlantis, Lemuria, and other lost advanced civilizations, because of course he did. Anyway, if your kids go to a Waldorf school, then their teachers had to complete the Waldorf teacher training program on top of their bachelor's degree, typically at one of these 5 schools in the US, where they are trained for several years in Rudolf Steiner's philosophies and teaching methods. Now, if this was all happening at private schools, then we would not have a problem here. However, literally thousands of taxpayer-funded charter schools in the United States are based off of esoteric or New Age spiritualist movements. Waldorf schools, Montessori schools, integral schools, holistic learning centers, theosophical schools, and then plenty of smaller local charter schools are pushing pseudoscience on our children, and they just get away with it. But this video's over an hour long now, so I don't really have time to get into the problem with charter schools in America, so I will leave you with this. Attempts to embrace holistic education in the United States have been extremely problematic. And I know at surface level, that's a stale take, and that it's gonna make me sound like one of those school is only about math, science, and reading type people, which I am not. Recess is wonderful. The arts are wonderful. Electives that allow you to study something that you actually care about in the middle of the day are wonderful. What I'm concerned about is just how many unverified, anti-intellectual, and pseudoscientific programs are making billions of dollars off of the school system every year, and how principals, department heads, therapists, and teachers are just embracing these programs willy-nilly without any understanding of where they actually come from and how those tools are used in their respective communities. If I said to you, hey, would you like your anti-vax cousin who believes in Atlantis conspiracies and thinks that the universe is literally speaking to him every time he smokes weed to be in charge of educating thousands of high schoolers in every major US city? You would probably say no. Especially if it was your tax dollars that were paying for it. But that's precisely what happens when your school district allows something like a publicly funded Waldorf charter school to be built. And then what's worse is when even the private versions try to hide what they truly are in the footnotes of their website, like this one performing arts high school in Boulder, Colorado, America's most well-educated anti-intellectual city. Or if I said to you, hey, your cousin who is very into horoscopes wants to divine your 17-year-old's universal archetype in order to determine what companies should be allowed to hire them and or what they should be allowed to major in college, you would lose your mind. And yet that's in many ways what's happening when things like MBTI get weaponized by bad actors in HR departments or career counseling offices. It's not that everyone who uses these things are bad actors. In fact, most of them aren't. And it's not that everyone who uses these things believes in astrology. In fact, most of them don't. But enough people do. Potentially 1 in every 4 if we're to believe those surveys. And when we are complacent about allowing pseudoscience into our therapy offices and our classrooms just because they have a little bit of practical utility, then we are opening up the doors for bad actors to impose their more problematic pseudoscientific beliefs upon our children. And that creates a pseudoscientific foundation for America's adults. And that culmination of 1,000 little nuggets of pseudoscience while you're growing up ends up building into a United States that we have today, where tons of educated adults are absolutely taken over by wacky conspiracy theories that have no grounding in evidence or science whatsoever. And that is what's heralding in this new age of anti-intellectualism.